A billionaire Omega paid me to give him an heir? Then he wanted me instead. Welcome, everyone. Before we begin today's emotional story, we have one small request. If you enjoy heartfelt BL stories filled with unforgettable characters, powerful emotions, and meaningful journeys, please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a future upload. It only takes a moment. It is completely free, and your support helps us continue creating more dramatic and inspiring stories for you. We truly appreciate every one of you who joins us on this journey. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. We always love seeing how far our stories travel and meeting viewers from different countries and time zones. Now let us begin today's story. The most dangerous contracts are never the ones signed with ink. They are the ones that quietly change your heart before you realize you have agreed to them. My name is Rowan Hale, and until the day I walked into the Whitmore estate, I believed money could solve almost any problem except loneliness. I had spent years working as a private architectural designer, restoring historic homes that wealthy families wanted to preserve without sacrificing their original character. It was honest work, and although I was far from rich, I earned enough to pay my bills and enjoy a quiet life. My projects took me from one city to another, but I always returned to the same small apartment where the greatest luxury I owned was a bookshelf filled with history, architecture, and travel journals. Then one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, everything changed because of a phone call I almost ignored. The woman on the line introduced herself as the executive assistant to Cashin Whitmore. Even if someone had never followed financial news, they knew that name. Cashin Whitmore was one of the youngest billionaire Omegas in the country, the chairman of the Whitmore Group, and the public face of countless charitable foundations supporting education, medical research, and community development. Despite extraordinary wealth, he rarely appeared at glamorous parties or celebrity events. Every interview focused on helping people rather than promoting himself, making him something of a mystery even among those who admired him. I assumed there had been a mistake. Surely someone like Cashin Whitmore had no reason to contact an architect from a small design firm. The assistant politely explained that her employer wished to discuss a confidential personal proposal and would compensate me generously simply for attending the meeting. Curiosity eventually overcame caution. 2 days later, I arrived at the Whitmore estate, an elegant historic mansion overlooking acres of beautifully preserved gardens. Unlike many luxurious properties I had restored, this place felt peaceful instead of intimidating. Fresh flowers decorated every hallway. Children's artwork hung beside priceless paintings, and every employee greeted visitors with genuine warmth rather than rehearsed politeness. It felt less like the home of a billionaire and more like a place carefully built to protect kindness from the outside world. I was escorted into a quiet library lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves where Cashin stood beside a large window overlooking an ancient oak tree. He turned as I entered, offering a calm smile that immediately challenged every assumption I had carried into the room. He did not project arrogance or superiority. Instead, he looked tired in the way people often do after carrying responsibilities too heavy to share. After introducing himself, he thanked me personally for accepting the invitation before asking about my work, my family, and the restoration projects I enjoyed most. Nearly 30 minutes passed before business was mentioned at all. Finally, Cashin folded his hands together and looked at me with quiet honesty. "What I am about to ask may sound impossible," he said gently. "If you decide to leave immediately, I will completely understand." I nodded, unsure what could possibly require such careful preparation. He took a slow breath before continuing. "My family has protected the Whitmore legacy for generations. They expect me to provide an heir, but I refuse to build a family through obligation alone. I am prepared to offer a generous legal agreement to someone I believe possesses integrity, compassion, and the ability to make thoughtful choices. I would like you to consider helping me create that future." I struggled to process what I had just heard. Before I could answer, Cashin added one final sentence that made the room fall completely silent. "I am not asking you to love me." For several long seconds, I could not find a single word to say. The library remained perfectly quiet except for the soft ticking of an antique clock resting above the fireplace. Cashin did not rush me, did not attempt to persuade me, and did not fill the silence with promises about wealth or privilege. He simply waited with remarkable patience, as though he believed every important decision deserved enough room to breathe. Finally, I looked at him and asked the only question that truly mattered. Why me? A faint smile crossed his face, but it carried more sadness than satisfaction. Because everyone else who accepted this conversation wanted my fortune before they understood my values, he answered honestly. You were the first person who spent 30 minutes talking about restoring old libraries, preserving history, and creating places where families could feel at home. I laughed quietly, still overwhelmed by the situation. That hardly sounds like a reason to ask someone to help build the future of your family. Cashin walked toward one of the tall bookshelves and carefully removed a leather-bound journal before placing it on the table between us. Perhaps not by itself, he admitted. But I have spent years learning that character reveals itself through ordinary conversations far more than extraordinary speeches. I opened the journal and immediately realized it was not a legal document. It contained handwritten notes, architectural sketches, photographs of restored community centers, children's drawings, and plans for future educational projects supported by the Whitmore Foundation. Every page reflected compassion rather than ambition. There were no lists of financial projections or personal achievements. Instead, Cashin had filled the journal with ideas for helping neighborhoods preserve their history while creating opportunities for future generations. This is what matters to me, he said quietly. The agreement I mentioned is only a practical solution to satisfy family expectations. The mission has always been much larger. I slowly closed the journal and looked back at him. Then why not marry someone you already love? His expression softened before he answered. Because I have never believed that another person should become part of my life simply to fulfill an obligation. He paused briefly before continuing. If love ever enters my life, I want it to arrive freely. Never because someone felt trapped by my circumstances. His honesty caught me completely off guard. Before I arrived at the estate, I had imagined a powerful billionaire determined to control every detail of his future. Instead, I found someone carrying enormous responsibility while desperately trying to protect the freedom of everyone around him. A gentle knock interrupted our conversation as an elderly gentleman entered the library carrying a tray with fresh tea and homemade pastries. Cashin immediately stood to help him place everything on the table despite the man's polite protests. Thank you, Mr. Ellis, Cashin said warmly. Please remind your granddaughter that I am looking forward to seeing her art exhibition next week. The older man's face brightened. She has been talking about it every day, sir. After he quietly left, I looked at Cashin with growing curiosity. You remember your employees' families? Cashin seemed surprised by the question. Of course. They have cared for this estate for years. Their families matter to me too. That simple answer revealed more about his character than any newspaper article ever could. We spent another hour discussing architecture, education, and community projects before any legal paperwork appeared. When his attorney finally entered with a neatly organized folder, Cashin spoke before the documents were even opened. Please understand one thing, Rowan. This agreement exists only if you choose it freely. If you walk out that door today, I will still be grateful that you shared your afternoon with me. As I glanced toward the large window overlooking the ancient oak tree, I realized I had arrived expecting to negotiate a contract. Instead, I had begun meeting a man whose greatest strength seemed to be his quiet determination to place kindness above power, and somehow that realization made the decision ahead far more complicated than I had ever imagined. When I finally left the Whitmore estate that evening, the unsigned agreement remained inside my briefcase, yet it felt strangely unimportant compared to everything else I had experienced. During the drive home, I found myself thinking less about the proposal itself and more about the quiet moments surrounding it. Cashin thanking every employee by name. The journal filled with children's artwork instead of financial achievements. The way he had spoken about family, not as an obligation, but as a place where people should always feel safe enough to be themselves. None of it matched the public image of an untouchable billionaire. Over the next several days I tried returning to my normal routine, but ordinary life suddenly felt different. Every restoration project reminded me of the Whitmore estate, not because of its wealth, but because of the warmth carefully preserved inside its walls. Late one afternoon, I received another call from Cashin's assistant. Expecting pressure about the agreement, I almost let the phone ring unanswered. Instead, She politely explained that Mr. Whitmore wished to invite me back for an entirely different reason. The estate was restoring a century-old conservatory that would become a free educational center for local children, and Cashin hoped I would offer architectural advice before construction began. There was no mention of contracts or heirs, only a request for my professional opinion. Curiosity won again. 2 days later, I returned to the estate, where Cashin greeted me with the same quiet smile as before. Instead of leading me into a conference room, he walked beside me through gardens filled with volunteers planting flowers alongside neighborhood families. Children laughed while painting small wooden birdhouses that would later hang throughout the grounds. Every spring we invite local families to help, Cashin explained. People care more deeply about places they help create. We spent the afternoon studying the aging conservatory. The building needed structural repairs, but its original stained glass windows remained remarkably beautiful. As I described possible restoration plans, Cashin listened carefully, occasionally asking thoughtful questions, but never pretending to know more than he did. It felt less like working for a billionaire and more like collaborating with an old friend. During a short break, we sat beneath the ancient oak tree overlooking the estate. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh grass while birds settled quietly among the branches above us. "Do you know why this tree matters so much to my family?" Cashin asked. I shook my head. He smiled faintly before looking toward the wide canopy. "My grandfather used to say that trees teach the difference between growth and speed. The strongest roots are the ones nobody sees." He paused before continuing. He believed families should be built the same way. I looked toward the enormous trunk, realizing the tree had likely witnessed generations of celebrations, losses, and quiet promises. "Your grandfather sounds like a remarkable man," I said. Cashin nodded thoughtfully. "He taught me that an heir is never simply someone who inherits a name. An heir should inherit compassion, wisdom, and the courage to leave the world kinder than they found it." Those words settled deeply within me. For the first time, I began to understand that the proposal he had made was never really about continuing a bloodline. It was about preserving values. As the afternoon came to an end, Mr. Ellis approached carrying freshly baked bread from the estate kitchen. He laughed softly as several children raced past him toward the gardens. "They always run here after school," he said proudly. "Mr. Whitmore insists everyone is welcome." I watched Cashin kneel beside a little girl struggling to carry a heavy watering can, gently helping her without drawing attention to himself. In that simple moment, something inside me quietly changed. I had arrived believing I was considering a contract. Instead, I was slowly discovering the extraordinary heart of the man who had offered it. As the weeks passed, my visits to the Whitmore estate became more frequent, though never because of the agreement still resting unsigned inside my desk drawer. Every visit centered on restoring another historic building, reviewing educational spaces, or discussing ways architecture could better serve families and children. The estate slowly transformed from an unfamiliar place into one that felt unexpectedly peaceful. I began recognizing gardeners by name, exchanging conversations with volunteers, and sharing coffee with Mr. Ellis whenever he insisted I take a break from measuring old stone walls. Yet one area of the estate remained closed to nearly everyone. Every afternoon, shortly before sunset, Cashin quietly disappeared into the oldest wing of the mansion. No employee ever followed him, and no visitor was invited inside. I never asked about it because everyone deserves a private place where the weight of responsibility can finally rest. One rainy evening, however, our restoration meeting lasted much longer than expected. As I prepared to leave, the lights flickered briefly before the estate lost power during the storm. Mr. Ellis apologized, explaining that the backup generators would need several minutes before every hallway became fully illuminated again. While waiting near the entrance, I noticed a heavy wooden door standing slightly open for the first time. Warm candlelight spilled gently into the hallway. Before I could look away, Cashin stepped out carrying several old books. Instead of appearing annoyed that someone had seen the room, he smiled softly. "Would you like to see the place my family rarely speaks about?" I hesitated before nodding. The room beyond looked nothing like a corporate archive. It resembled a carefully preserved museum filled with journals, paintings, handwritten letters, and architectural drawings dating back generations. Portraits of Whitmore ancestors lined the walls, yet none emphasized wealth or status. Nearly every painting showed families working beside schools, hospitals, farms, or community projects. At the center of the room stood a circular table crafted from ancient oak. Resting upon it was a beautifully bound volume simply titled The Book of Guardians. Cashin gently placed one hand upon its weathered cover. Most people believe my family stayed influential because we built successful companies, he said quietly. The truth is far less glamorous. He opened the first pages, revealing handwritten promises passed from one generation to the next. Each guardian had recorded not financial achievements, but acts of service completed for communities during their lifetime. One founded orphan schools after devastating floods. Another financed hospitals during epidemics. Another restored libraries destroyed by fires. This, Cashin continued, is the legacy I inherited. I slowly turned another page, noticing one recurring sentence written in different handwriting across decades. A true heir is recognized by character before inheritance. Is that why your family expects an heir? I asked. Cashin nodded thoughtfully. Yes, but many people misunderstand the tradition. They believe the next generation inherits our fortune. What truly matters is whether someone inherits our purpose. His voice remained calm, yet I could hear years of quiet pressure beneath every word. That is why I could never choose someone based on reputation, influence, or convenience. Outside, the rain continued tapping gently against the tall windows while the candles filled the room with warm golden light. I realized I was no longer looking at the history of an extraordinarily wealthy family. I was looking at generations of ordinary kindness carefully preserved across extraordinary lives. As we prepared to leave the archive, Cashin paused beside the final page of the ancient book where one blank line waited beneath every previous signature. He looked at it for only a moment before quietly saying, almost to himself, "The greatest fear I have has never been failing my family. It has always been passing on their name without passing on their heart." The words written inside the Book of Guardians remained with me long after I returned home. I had accepted many restoration projects throughout my career, carefully preserving old buildings so future generations could appreciate their history. But this was the first time I realized that a family's greatest inheritance might never be its wealth. It could be its values. For several days I found myself rereading the unsigned agreement resting inside my desk. The financial details no longer caught my attention. Instead, I kept remembering Cashin's quiet confession beneath the candlelight. He had never feared losing his fortune. He feared passing on a name without passing on compassion. Late one afternoon, I received another invitation to the Whitmore estate. This time there were no architects, attorneys, or project managers waiting. Cashin simply asked whether I would join him for dinner. The meal was unexpectedly simple. Fresh bread from the estate kitchen, homemade soup, roasted vegetables, and tea served beneath the wide branches of the ancient oak tree as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the gardens. During the conversation, Cashin spoke very little about business. Instead, he asked about my parents, the teachers who had inspired me as a child, and the neighborhoods I had helped restore over the years. He listened with genuine interest, smiling whenever I described children discovering forgotten community libraries or old theaters brought back to life. Eventually, Mr. Ellis approached with a small wooden box wrapped in faded blue cloth. He carefully placed it on the table before quietly excusing himself. Cashin opened the lid and removed several handwritten letters protected inside delicate envelopes. "These belong to every guardian before me," he explained. "Each one wrote a message for the next generation, hoping experience might become wisdom." He handed me the oldest letter. The handwriting had faded with time, but one sentence remained perfectly clear. "A family survives only when every child grows inside a home where kindness is practiced before it is preached." I slowly returned the letter, understanding why Cashin had guarded these traditions so carefully. "Did your family always understand that?" I asked softly. He smiled with quiet honesty. "No. Every generation had to learn it again." He looked toward the oak tree standing peacefully behind us. There were times when members of my family believed influence mattered more than compassion. Those choices always created regret. Eventually, someone remembered why the Whitmore name existed in the first place. His calm voice carried no bitterness, only gratitude for lessons preserved across time. After dinner, we walked through the gardens where volunteers had recently completed a playground for neighborhood children. The swings were empty now, gently moving with the evening breeze. Cashin stopped beside a wooden bench overlooking the playground. "May I tell you something I have never told anyone outside my family?" he asked. I nodded. When I first considered asking someone to help create an heir, I believed I was solving a responsibility. Then I met you again, and something quietly changed. You never asked how much the agreement was worth. You asked whether the future child would grow up feeling loved. I had almost forgotten asking that question during our first meeting, but he had remembered every word. Cashin smiled faintly before continuing. That was the moment I realized the agreement itself had never been the answer. A child deserves more than careful planning. A child deserves a family built by people who genuinely choose to remain beside one another. His words settled gently into the silence between us. As we walked back toward the mansion beneath the evening sky, I finally understood what the elderly guardians had been trying to preserve for generations. The future of the Whitmore family had never depended on finding someone willing to fulfill a contract. It depended on finding someone who believed that love, patience, and everyday kindness were the only true inheritance worth leaving behind. When I returned to my apartment that night, I placed the unsigned agreement on my dining table and stared at it for a long time. Weeks earlier, I had believed the document represented the most important decision of my life. Now it felt like little more than a reminder of how much both of us had changed. The pages still described responsibilities, legal protections, and future expectations, but nowhere could they describe the quiet conversations beneath the oak tree, the laughter of children filling the Whitmore gardens, or the way Cashin always stopped whatever he was doing to help someone who needed him. Those were the things that mattered now. The following morning, I received another invitation from the estate, but this one felt different. There was no meeting agenda attached, and no architectural drawings waiting for my review. Cashin simply asked whether I would join him for a walk before breakfast. When I arrived, I found him standing beside the conservatory we had been restoring together. Morning sunlight poured through the repaired stained glass windows, filling the room with warm colors that danced across the stone floor. For a while, we simply admired the finished work in comfortable silence. Finally, Cashin spoke. "The conservatory is beautiful because people cared enough to restore what others believed had become too old to matter." I smiled. "History survives because someone chooses not to abandon it." He nodded thoughtfully before looking toward the gardens. "I have been thinking about our agreement." My heartbeat quickened, but his voice remained calm. I realized something after our last conversation. I spent years believing I was searching for the right person to help fulfill a responsibility. The truth is that I never stopped to ask whether that responsibility had already begun changing me into someone I did not want to become. We slowly walked beneath the ancient oak tree while volunteers prepared the gardens for another community event. Children from a nearby elementary school would soon arrive to plant flowers and paint small wooden signs for the walking paths. Watching everyone work together, it became impossible to separate the Whitmore legacy from the people it quietly served every day. As we reached a quiet stone bench, Cashin removed a folded document from his jacket. I immediately recognized the agreement I had taken home weeks earlier. Without a word, he placed it between us. "I would like to withdraw it," he said gently. I looked at him in surprise. "You no longer want an heir?" A faint smile crossed his face. "I still hope to have a family someday, but I no longer believe a contract should ever be the first chapter of that story." Before I could respond, he carefully folded the document once more and placed it back inside the envelope unopened. "If the future ever gives me a child," he continued quietly, "I want that child to grow up knowing they were welcomed by two people who freely chose one another, not by two signatures on a legal page." His words filled me with both admiration and unexpected sadness because I realized how much courage it had taken for him to abandon the solution he had spent years convincing himself was necessary. Later that afternoon, after returning home, I found myself unable to concentrate on work. Every blueprint blurred into memories of shared conversations, quiet smiles, and simple acts of kindness. For the first time since meeting Cashin, I admitted a truth I had been carefully avoiding. I was no longer afraid of the agreement. I was afraid that by walking away now, I might also be walking away from the one person who had quietly taught me that the strongest families are never built by obligation, but by two hearts willing to choose the same future together. The days following our conversation beneath the oak tree felt strangely quiet. Cashin never called to change my mind, never sent another agreement, and never used his influence to pull me back toward the Whitmore estate. Instead, he respected the silence, allowing me the same freedom he had always insisted every important decision deserved. That simple act of restraint made me admire him even more. I buried myself in restoration projects, hoping work would quiet the thoughts constantly returning to the estate. Yet every old building I repaired reminded me of the lesson Cashin had taught without realizing it. Some things become stronger not because they are replaced, but because someone believes they are worth restoring. Nearly 3 weeks passed before I received an unexpected invitation from the Whitmore Foundation. It was not addressed personally to me. The foundation was hosting its annual Community Legacy Forum, bringing together educators, volunteers, architects, historians, and nonprofit leaders to discuss projects benefiting future generations. My own restoration work had earned a place among this year's featured presentations. There was no mention of Cashin. Curious but cautious, I accepted. The forum occupied the entire weekend, filling the Whitmore Conference Center with hundreds of guests from across the country. During the opening reception, I found myself speaking with community organizers, teachers, and preservation experts who had collaborated with the Whitmore Foundation for decades. What surprised me most was how consistently everyone described Cashin. No one praised his wealth first. They spoke instead about handwritten thank you notes, unexpected visits to small community projects, and quiet acts of generosity that had never appeared in newspapers. Later that afternoon, while touring an exhibit showcasing the foundation's history, I met an elderly gentleman studying a display of old photographs beneath the familiar symbol of the Whitmore oak tree. His name was Theodore Grant, and after introducing himself, he smiled warmly when he learned I had been working with Cashin on several restoration projects. "You have become important to him," Theodore said with remarkable certainty. I immediately shook my head. "I think you misunderstand." Theodore chuckled softly. "My young friend, I have served the Whitmore family for over 40 years. I have watched generations grow into their responsibilities. I rarely misunderstand people." We continued walking through the exhibit until we reached a collection of letters written by former guardians. Theodore paused before one particular display. "Many people believe Cashin would eventually accept one of the political marriage proposals offered to strengthen the family's influence," he explained. "There were many opportunities." I looked at him in surprise. "He never mentioned any of that." Theodore nodded. "Because he did not consider those offers important." He smiled gently before continuing. "Every proposal promised greater influence, stronger business alliances, and extraordinary advantages for the Whitmore name. Cashin declined every one of them." "Why?" I asked quietly. Theodore's expression softened with unmistakable respect. "Because he believed a family created for strategy would never produce the kind of heir his grandfather hoped for." He folded his hands behind his back as we continued walking. "When he first spoke about you, he did not describe your profession or accomplishments. He simply said he had finally met someone who asked how a future child might feel instead of asking what they might inherit." I stopped walking altogether. Theodore noticed my silence, but continued kindly. "That single question changed everything. For the first time, Cashin stopped searching for someone who could continue the Whitmore name. He began hoping to find someone willing to share the Whitmore heart." As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating generations of photographs celebrating ordinary kindness instead of extraordinary power, I realized the greatest truth had been hidden in plain sight from the very beginning. Cashin had never truly been searching for an heir. He had quietly been searching for a home. The conversation with Theodore remained in my thoughts long after the Community Legacy Forum ended. As I drove home that evening, I realized I had spent weeks believing Cashin had offered me a place in his future because he needed someone to satisfy a centuries-old tradition. Now I understood the truth was almost the opposite. He had walked away from every convenient solution because he refused to build a family without sincerity. The agreement had disappeared, yet somehow our connection had become more meaningful than it had ever been while the contract still existed. 2 days later, I found myself standing outside the Whitmore estate once again, not because anyone had invited me, but because there was one conversation I could no longer postpone. The familiar gardens welcomed me with the peaceful atmosphere I had come to associate with the estate. Volunteers were helping children paint flower pots for a community fundraiser, and laughter drifted gently through the afternoon air. Everything looked exactly as it always had, yet I felt completely different. Mr. Ellis noticed me first and smiled warmly. "He is beneath the oak tree," he said before I could ask. "I think he has been spending more time there lately." I thanked him and slowly walked along the stone path until the enormous branches came into view. Cashin sat alone on the wooden bench, reading one of the old Guardian journals. He looked up as my footsteps approached, and genuine surprise softened into a quiet smile. "Rowan," he said gently, "I was not expecting you." I sat beside him beneath the wide canopy, listening to birds singing somewhere above us. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The silence felt comfortable, not awkward, as though we had finally reached the place where words no longer needed to hurry. Finally, I looked toward the gardens where children were planting young trees beside volunteers. "Theodore told me something during the forum," I said. Cashin lowered his eyes with an almost embarrassed smile. "I can probably guess." I turned toward him. "He told me you turned down every political marriage your family arranged." Cashin nodded once. "Yes." "He also said you stopped looking for someone to continue the Whitmore name and started hoping to find someone willing to share the Whitmore heart." For the first time since we met, Cashin seemed unable to answer immediately. After a long pause, he quietly admitted, "That is true." I smiled gently. "Why did you never tell me?" He looked toward the old oak tree before replying. "Because I wanted you to make every decision without feeling responsible for my feelings. If you chose to leave, I wanted you to leave without guilt. If you ever chose to stay, I wanted it to be because your heart arrived there on its own." His answer dissolved every remaining doubt inside me. I realized that every meaningful choice he had made had been guided by the same principle. Freedom before obligation. Respect before expectation. Kindness before tradition. I reached into my bag and removed the envelope containing the unsigned agreement that I had carried for weeks. Cashin looked at it, but made no move to take it. Instead, I quietly placed it on the bench between us. "I did not come back because of this," I said. He nodded softly. "I know." I looked directly into his eyes and smiled with a certainty I had never felt before. "I came back because somewhere along the way, you stopped asking me to help build your family's future, and quietly became the future I wanted to build with you." For a long moment, neither of us moved. The unsigned agreement remained resting on the bench between us, untouched, no longer carrying the importance it once had. Cashin looked at the envelope before slowly lifting his eyes to meet mine. There was warmth there, but also unmistakable relief, as though a burden he had carried for years had quietly disappeared without a single word needing to explain it. A gentle smile spread across his face, softer than any expression I had seen before. "Then I do not need that anymore," he said quietly. Without opening the envelope, he placed it beside the roots of the ancient oak tree, allowing the evening breeze to lift its corner before calmly folding it closed one final time. We remained beneath the wide branches while the last sunlight painted the gardens in shades of gold. Around us, volunteers finished cleaning the flower beds as children proudly carried home the young trees they had planted earlier that afternoon. Watching them laugh together, I suddenly realized that every important moment in my life with Cashin had happened in places built for other people rather than for ourselves. Schools, gardens, libraries, restoration projects, and community centers had quietly become the chapters of our own story. Months passed, and our relationship grew naturally, never rushed by expectations or traditions. We continued restoring historic buildings together, expanding educational programs through the Whitmore Foundation, and spending countless weekends listening to teachers, parents, artists, and volunteers describe the communities they hoped to strengthen. Every new project reminded us that lasting change always began with ordinary people choosing to care for one another. Eventually, one peaceful autumn afternoon beneath the same oak tree where everything had changed, Cashin looked at me with the same honesty that had first earned my trust. "Years ago, I believed I needed someone to help me continue the Whitmore legacy," he said. "Now I understand that a legacy is never carried by one person alone." I smiled as I reached for his hand. Legacies grow the same way gardens do. They need people willing to care for them every day. Several years later, The Whitmore estate welcomed families from across the country for the opening of the Whitmore Family Legacy Center, a place dedicated to supporting children through education, mentorship, creative programs, and community partnerships. Instead of celebrating corporate success, the opening ceremony honored teachers, caregivers, volunteers, and young students whose kindness had transformed their neighborhoods. The Old Book of Guardians received one final edition. For the first time in generations, the final page did not speak about preserving wealth or continuing a bloodline. It spoke about preserving compassion through every generation willing to choose it. The Whitmore family also quietly revised its oldest tradition. Future heirs would never again be measured by birth alone. They would be recognized by empathy, integrity, generosity, and the willingness to place people before power. Visitors entering the Hall of Founders now pause before a new bronze sculpture standing beneath the ancient oak tree. It depicts two people walking side by side, neither leading nor following, while a child plants a young sapling nearby. The inscription beneath it reads, "Every lasting legacy begins when love becomes a choice made again each day." Whenever young visitors ask why that message matters so much, I always answer with the lesson that changed my own life. Wealth can build magnificent homes, but only kindness can make them worth returning to. Titles may preserve a family name, but only compassion allows that name to be remembered with gratitude. Looking back now, I understand that the greatest gift Cashin ever offered me was never the agreement that first brought us together. It was the quiet courage to let it go, trusting that if love was real, neither contracts nor expectations would ever be needed to keep two hearts walking toward the same future.